Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Roberta Wall. I'm from Asheville, North Carolina, as are probably most of us on this call. I'm really excited and grateful to be part of the team that is presenting this call tonight. More than 300 people have registered, which gives me such real hope that in Asheville, we can consider and move toward creating new approaches that can end up delivering public safety for everyone. Creating this public access forum is a step toward bringing everyone who's affected by policing, by public safety to the table. And of course, that is everyone. There is no one in our society who is not affected by how policing is done, by how we are kept safe. So we need to bring everyone to the table, because how else will we know what the people's needs are, what people's preferences are? So this is a great step toward that. And the webinar tonight, we just wanted to start by thanking the co-sponsors, or the co-sponsors, which is the Racial Justice Coalition, the Elder Vigil Group, and the Ethical Humanist Society of Asheville. Additionally, there's numbers of people who have forwarded the email, sent out the email. That's still me talking. I don't know why we're losing our photos, but it doesn't matter. And we also want to acknowledge and thank the people behind the scenes who are probably trying to fix the video right now as we speak. We really want to also acknowledge that there are numerous Asheville City and Buncombe County officials and staff who are on the call, who've asked about participating and seeing the recording. That is also extremely encouraging for us. And most of all, we want to thank Professor Alex Vitale for generously donating his time and the fruits of his 30 years of research into effective models of policing and municipal programs that create public safety for all. So before I introduce our panelists and speakers, I just want everyone to note that the program is being recorded, and no one will be shown on the recording other than the three folks who you're looking at right now. So that way you will be able to share the recording widely. Everyone who has registered will get a follow-up email with the recording. And the chat after Grits and Rob and Alex share what they're going to share, then we're going to open the chat for questions and answers. And if you click on chat, you'll see questions sent here. So send your questions there. So now, can you all hear me? It's funny talking and just, okay. So let me first introduce Robert Thomas. Want to wave, Rob, so everybody knows we're introducing you. Rob is a 33-year-old native of Asheville, North Carolina. He's an experienced community leader with a knack for innovation, who centers his work around advocating for those most impacted by the inequities of the criminal justice system. As a former justice-involved individual himself, Rob understands the negative impacts and disparities faced by people of color in the carceral system. With over 10 years of direct experience, Robert has now narrowed his focus to racial justice, decarceration, and activism around police accountability. In addition, Rob is the newly named community liaison for the Racial Justice Coalition of Asheville and a partner of a minority-owned equity consulting firm. Thank you, Rob. The next person I want to introduce is Grits. You want to wave, Grits? Grits is I'm reading her words here. Grits is a young activist who has been doing work around racial equity and intersectionality for 2 years with a focus on research and community outreach. Rob and Grits are the newest members of the Racial Justice Coalition. I think I said that wrong. Grits is the newest member of the Racial Justice Coalition. And then the last person I'm introducing is Professor Alex Vitale. Want to give a wave, Alex, who's sitting in my hometown of Brooklyn, New York. Yay. Alex is a professor of sociology and a coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and a visiting professor at London South Bank University. He has spent the last 30 years writing about policing and consults to both police departments and human rights organizations internationally. Professor Vitale is the author of City of Disorder: How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics, and he's also the author of The End of Policing. His academic writings on policing have appeared in numerous publications, including Policing and Society, Police Practice and Research, Mobilization, and Contemporary Sociology. He is also a frequent essayist whose writings have been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, and The Guardian. And we'll post in the chat more info on Divest and Invest from the Racial Justice Coalition, and also an article about Professor Vitale that was in the Washington Post. So thank you all. Thank you everyone in Asheville for being here and beyond Asheville, and turning it over to the rest of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roberta. And I'm realizing I need to work on the brevity of my introduction intros for folks. Tonight, first, we're really excited to have you, Professor Vitale. But you know, as we come into this space, it was really important for me and Rob to kind of recognize the space that we are holding and kind of create and kind of ground ourselves within this, and I guess ultimately address the elephant in the room, which is the fact that tonight we're presenting like alongside a white cis male voice. And we understand the importance of centering Black and Brown voices and liberation, and we constantly try to do that. And we were hesitant about holding this space with Alex for a bit, you know, because as the Racial Justice Coalition, we believe that within liberation work, we need to uphold and bolster our Black and Brown communities' voices, but with the knowledge he brings to the topic of abolition and divestment and the necessity for this conversation to be had within our community, we thought it would be great to have him here to kind of, you know, allow for us to create tools, I guess, on what it looks like for Asheville to move forward in reimagining public safety. And so with that being said, I just want to start with a quick question to Alex. How do you check yourself and hold yourself accountable doing this work as a white cis male?
Well, thanks, Grits and Rob and everyone for giving me this opportunity to hold space with you and to explore these tremendously important topics. And it is an unusual situation, but I have been doing this work for decades, and my own personal experience is not irrelevant here. You know, I come from a family that was part of the labor movement for generations, coal miners in Southern Illinois, who experienced police violence, police repression. And I myself have experienced police violence and also interpersonal violence, and also supported people who've been incarcerated, who were childhood friends, et cetera. So these are not abstract questions to me, but it's been tremendously important in this moment that we're centering anti-Black racism in this conversation. That's been, one of the most important developments of the last decade is the centering of that. And I have tried to be accountable to that movement. And I see myself as playing a supporting role in that movement. And that means that I'm in constant conversation and dialogue with people in that movement so that I'm getting feedback about whether or not my interventions are helping that movement. And for me, that's the metric here. It's, I have the luxury of being a tenured full professor so that I'm not answerable to the academic establishment or the, strategic directives of Brooklyn College. I'm able to act in the interests of the movement. And so that's what guides my work.
Thank you so much. And if Rob wants to add anything, he can. If not, we can kind of get right into it if you're feeling ready for that.
Yes, just another quick question. Who makes up the circle that provides you your accountability, your connectivity to this work?
Well, I'm not sure I want to name every name because then, right, that's not entirely appropriate, but I work, for instance, with the leadership of the Movement for Black Lives. I work with people in law for Black Lives, the Advancement Project, the Civil Rights Corps. And then I have personal connections with people. But I sit on various advisory boards and work in concert with folks in these organizations on a daily basis.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm sorry.
Okay, are we? So should I start?
Yes, sir.
Great. I'm super excited to get to the Q&A, so I will not, drone on endlessly. But, after the deaths of Eric Garner and Mike Brown and Tamir Rice and so many others, Sandra Bland, we were told, don't worry, we're going to fix policing. The Obama administration, local mayors and police chiefs said, oh, we got some reforms. We had to push, they were pushed into some of them, but they said, oh, okay, we're going to fix policing. The Obama administration issued this task force on 21st century policing report with all these recommendations for procedural reforms to policing, implicit bias training and body cameras and de-escalation training and changes to use of force policies. And we were told this was going to fix it. But that hasn't worked. The officers, for instance, who were involved in the killing of George Floyd had implicit bias training, de-escalation training, mindfulness training. We're wearing body cameras. We're operating under a new use of force policy that emphasized sanctity of life. We're operating under a new policy that required that officers intervene to protect life and to stop misconduct by fellow officers. They were operating under an early warning system to identify problematic officers. And none of it made any difference. None of it saved his life. And the number of people being killed by the police each year remains unchanged. The war on drugs is continuing. The racial disparities in police arrests and incarceration rates continue. And we merely need to look at police behavior over the last 6 months in relationship to the protests and the movements for Black liberation to see that policing has not been reformed. And that's why the movement on the streets this summer, no one was holding up a sign saying more money for police body cameras. No one was holding up a sign saying more money for implicit bias training. Instead, people were saying defund the police. And what that signaled, as imperfect a slogan as it may be, is the rejection of the idea that we're going to fix policing with a series of superficial procedural reforms. and that instead we need to ask fundamental questions about the role of police in our society and what other kinds of options we can pursue. So let's look for a second at some of the reforms that continue to be touted by congressional leaders in the Democratic Party and big city mayors. Things like implicit bias training, which I know has been attempted in Asheville. Implicit bias training says that the problem of policing and racism is that officers have unconscious, unintentional biases that they're not aware of, and that this skews their behavior. And that if we merely give them some training, this will help them to overcome these unconscious and unintentional biases. Well, there are several problems with this. First of all, we have a problem of explicit racism in American policing. We just need to look at the chat boards, at the Facebook pages, at the official statements of police union leaders. Here in New York City, just this week, a very high-ranking officer was suspended without pay because he was using a pseudonym to go on racist rants on chat boards. And they managed to connect him up with this pseudonym. And it turns out his job in the police department was to protect officers from racist and sexist behavior within the police department. And yet he himself was explicitly a racist. And of course, we've seen this week too, the alliance between police officers and the kind of racist white nationalist movements that attack the Capitol. No amount of implicit bias training is going to fix that. But we also have a problem of structural racism. Not all police officers are racist. We have a growing number of Black and brown police officers. But in a way, that doesn't matter, because our elected officials have structured the mission of policing in a way that inherently reproduces racial inequality, because it increases the burdens, the negative burdens of the criminal legal system on the already most disadvantaged and vulnerable communities. Police will say, well, we just go where the crime is. Now, first of all, that's not entirely true. We know, for instance, that the drug war does not just go where the drugs are. It targets Black and brown communities almost exclusively, sometimes poor white communities as well. But here in New York, there are no buy and bust operations happening on Wall Street, even though we know drug use is widespread there. But even when they do target where the crime is, of course, they're defining crime in a particular way. They're not arresting landlords for allowing lead paint to go unaddressed. They're not arresting predatory bankers who are stealing resources from the community and taking people's homes. They're focused on a very narrow notion of street crime. It turns out that the value of stolen wages by employers is greater than all property crime combined by several magnitudes. But this isn't considered a policing problem. Policing, when we turn policing over when we choose policing as the strategy to address community problems, we are unleashing violence workers. That's what distinguishes police from all other parts of city government, is that capacity and authorization to use force. And their presence, their command authority is rooted in that capacity to use violence. And this is the problem with something like community policing. We're going to see a lot of talk about community policing from the Biden administration. They're going to put more money into community policing. And that sounds like a positive reform on the surface. Don't we want the police to know the community, to listen to community concerns? The problem is, first, that they never really listen to the entire community. They listen to certain segments of the community that they often have an alliance with. The landlords, the small business owners, the church leaders sometimes, right? There are no young people in these community policing meetings, very rarely. Recent immigrants, people who've had trouble with the criminal legal system, these people are systematically excluded from that process. But really, there's a bigger problem with community policing, because the whole premise of community policing is that the community is supposed to bring its problems to the police so that the police can work out a solution. But what tools do the police have to solve our community problems? Guns, ticket books, handcuffs, tear gas. These are not the tools to solve our community problems. Do they have access to affordable housing, high quality mental health services, drug treatment services, jobs for our young people, counselors in schools? They don't have any of those things. They don't have any of the tools that would actually produce healthier and safer communities. So how did we get into this mess of turning all the problems of already vulnerable communities into problems to be solved by violence workers backed up by mass incarceration? Well, the problem is that for generations now, there's been a kind of bipartisan consensus among government officials that in the face of global competition, all local places can do is take their limited resources and subsidize the already most successful players in the economy to push wealth up the economic ladder through tax breaks for the rich, subsidies, downtown real estate abatement, tax abatements, right? All these little deals that they make to subsidize the already wealthy in hopes that some of that wealth will trickle down to the rest of us. But it hasn't worked. The trickle down has never materialized. Wages are declining, standards of living are declining, life expectancies are declining for all but the very wealthy. Instead, what it's produced is mass homelessness, mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, failed schools, mass involvement in black market activities of drugs and sex work and stolen and pirated goods for survival. And then instead of actually addressing those problems, they're turned over to the police to manage, not to solve, right? Policing doesn't solve these problems. It manages them. It puts a lid on them. It keeps those problems from interfering with the downtown development deals and the subsidies. And it puts a lid on them so that they can keep getting reelected, so they can cobble together these electoral forces so that they can keep making these deals. So how do we get out of this mess of turning every social problem in poor and non-white communities over to the police to manage? Well, we have to demand real solutions to our community problems. We have to reject this idea, this false choice that our communities are given, which is either you can have police or you can have nothing. Because that's the false choice we've been given, right, for so long. And of course, the community, when they're given this false choice, they're stuck. What are they going to do? Well, many of them choose the police. And we see this, right? Because now everything is a police problem. Somebody's too noisy. There's a loose dog. There's some litter on the street. Call the police, because there's no one else to call. We have to give people someone else to call. Between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. But we've defunded mental health services. We closed down the hospitals. We failed to invest in community-based services. And so now When a young person is in crisis and a mom calls for help, do they get a mental health clinician? No, they get a police response. And too often, the outcome of that is a horrible tragedy. And the solution to this is not to give the police more money for more training, the police department more money to hire social workers to ride around with the police. The solution is to create actual mental health services, to create non-police crisis response teams, to create drop-in centers in the community where people can go for help without worrying about being turned over to the criminal legal system or forced into a hospital. Places that have done this have reduced the role of police, have reduced violent outcomes, have reduced the cost of emergency room visits, have reduced the number of people in forced hospitalizations, and have improved the quality of life for vulnerable communities. So defund the police was never about just taking money away from the police. Like it's just like a punishment to the police. No. This movement is about saying there are resources that communities need to become healthier and safer places. And one of the reasons we're told we can't have those resources is because the police department takes up half the city budget. And this is what we see around the country. When we look at the cost of policing, courts, local jails, it's often 50% of municipal budgets. They're sucking up all the resources and providing totally inadequate services to us. They're not actually making our communities healthy and safer. And this is not just about little things. It's not just about getting police out of schools or getting them out of the mental health business. It's also about addressing issues of serious violence. Policing doesn't work very well there. Let's look at intimate partner violence. We know that the vast majority of interpersonal intimate partner violence is never even reported to the police, especially in Black and brown communities. In part because women primarily and children have not been well served by police interventions in this area, because we've turned family crises into police problems. And what tools do the police have to solve our family problems? Making an arrest, threatening someone. But what most people want is to actually fix their families, not to have their partner arrested, not to have their family split apart. They want help, but police can't give them any help. All they can do is take someone to jail, who then almost always just gets out eventually, and often just the cycle is repeated. We need to look at real family supports that try to figure out how to keep families together. And when that's not possible, to give people real avenues to living independently so that they're not forced to stay in a situation that's dangerous for them or unhealthy. But policing doesn't do any of that. Look at youth violence. We have a problem of youth violence around the country. And we're told that the solution to this is gang injunctions, gang conspiracy cases, harassing young people on the streets, calling them gangbangers and super predators. Some of them as young as 13, 14, 15 years old, and we're just Xing them out. Policing says the way we make communities safer is to cancel out swaths of the community, to erase them, to remove them, to throw their lives away. That doesn't sound like justice to me. What we need are strategies to repair the harm, to stop the cycle of violence, to lift people up, to repair the damage. We don't break the cycle of violence by taking young people and putting them in a criminal justice system that's more violent than the streets are, where gang activity is almost mandatory. We break the cycle of violence by addressing the traumas, by giving kids pathways to self-sufficiency in adulthood. One of the things we know about serious youth violence is that almost every young person who commits an act of serious violence has been the victim of serious violence previously, either directly or witnessing that violence in their home, among their friends, and this includes police violence. Nationally, police are responsible for almost 10% of all homicides in the country. This is a huge threat to public health. And in fact, the American Public Health Association recently took a position that said policing is such a threat to the public health of poor and non-white communities that they support divesting from policing and investing in communities instead. This is a growing national movement that is rooted in evidence, that is driven by people who have experienced the failures of policing firsthand, and is trying to create both more justice and more safety. So I will stop there, and I'll be very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. Would you like to start with questions first, Grits, or would you like me to dive in?
No, you can start out if you're ready.
Okay. So the first question that I would like to propose to you would be, what trends have you seen within reform that have led you to take such a strong stance on abolition? And you just really just went into a lot of that, but any additional things?
Yeah. So, one of the things about, my position in this movement is that I'm a sort of technically trained police scholar. So I have spent decades looking at the research. Does implicit bias training work? Does de-escalation training work? Are body cameras going to solve these problems? And they're not. They don't work. The people who are selling that stuff are doing it because it serves a political purpose, not because it works. It's a way of saying to communities that they're doing something. They're responding to the community demands, but in a way that doesn't really make them change anything. And implicit bias training, I'm sorry to say, is really the worst offender here. It's the perfect liberal solution to the problem because it allows them to say they're doing something about racism where no one is to blame, no one has any actual responsibility for it. It's all a big accident and misunderstanding, and we promise to just shoot fewer Black people in the future. It's a scam designed to divert our movements and to give police more resources. So the literature said, the research literature is just incredibly pessimistic, and that has been my experience over the last 30 years.
Thank you for that. And I kind of want to, because I think it's a big topic that's been brought up in our community is, and I just want to discuss this with you a little bit, this idea of the end of policing and the end of public safety and the convolution of the two. And, I'll kind of start with a story, I guess. I was just up in Minneapolis doing an audio project, and in George Floyd Square, the community has created this space, the safe space where they can go around their communities and they can address poverty and they can address homelessness, hunger, domestic abuse, and their community members are calling on them rather than the police, because of course we know about Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, and George Floyd and all the other names that, you know, led to Minneapolis often being called Murderapolis. And so like within this square, they're perfectly addressing like what it means to end policing, or to, I guess, eradicate policing, but not at the expense of ending the safety of their communities, because they know that, you know, policing itself is the root of a lot of the unsafety within their community. And so I just wanted you to kind of touch on that idea. And sorry, I was just in Minneapolis. I've been driving for like 12 hours, but just touch on that subject a little bit. And
Sure.
also, like, it feels almost like a Stockholm syndrome, right? Like you were saying, we're given a choice. We can either have police or no police, but there's nothing that's found in the middle. And how, you know, how do we confront these anxieties that exist within like this middle, this Stockholm syndrome per se, you know?
Right. I think, and what's going on in Minneapolis is so fascinating. And I think there's so much more to that story that hasn't played out yet. And we're all watching it so closely. So I'm glad you're there talking to folks. One of the challenges of this movement is to talk to people in the communities about this false choice and to begin to give them a sense of the possibilities of something different. And this looks like a couple of different things. What some folks are focused on is mobilizing the resources they already have. In other words, helping people to develop strategies for dealing with problems without calling the police, and instead calling on a network of friends, calling on a local provider of some kind, or even creating some new structures out of the resources the community has. Who has knowledge, who has expertise, who has experience, who has wisdom about these things, who can help us. I think Patrice Cullors in her memoir talks about when one of her family members has a mental health crisis, they try not to call the police. Instead, they have a kind of network of family and friends that they can call on to help them come and resolve this problem, so that they don't have to worry about the police making a mistake. The other thing this looks like is the demand for more resources, because the reality is a lot of these neighborhoods are terribly under-resourced. The attempt to use kind of a mutual aid approach, while important, may not be enough. And so we need to do both these things. We need to better mobilize the resources we have available, and we need to bring in new resources, ideally under community control. It's a community mental health center with a community board of directors. It's a community drug treatment harm reduction center. It's a community family center. It's a community violence interruption or community mediation center, right? So that it's accountable to the specific needs of the community rather than the forces downtown.
Yeah, great answer. Next question I wanna pose to you. You know, myself, I have previous justice involvement and definitely have experienced the other spectrum of life, I guess, as you will, right? The less amount of opportunities, the feeling that you have to engage in criminal activity, or what they've classified as criminal activity, in order to survive, because, you know, nobody's hiring you. Nobody's, you know, the job market is terrible. And then the jobs that you could possibly get are so low on the totem pole that your existence would be so meager that you would pretty much be working just to pay your bills and live and then go back to work. And, you know, that's your option, either that or engage in some criminal activity. So here we've seen a drastic increase in violent crime. And, you know, I've read some of the blogs, I've read some of the newspaper articles where we're supposedly ranked, and this number could be wrong, I want to say 10th in the nation for a community of our size as far as violent crime goes. And, you know, I've seen responses such as, oh, we need more police officers, or, oh, it's because we have less police officers. But in my mind, that's not the issue at all. You know, police officers, from what I can understand, like you said, they're not preventing the crime. They're not addressing the root cause of the issue. They're there to manage it. You know, they're reactionary. They're showing up after a crime has been committed. Do you what with the spike in violent crime being going up so drastically over a short period of time? How would you see better addressing this, or do you believe that more police officers would fix the situation?
Great. So we have a massive apparatus of policing, and it's not working. That's what we see right now. And of course, whenever crime goes down, the police say it's because something they did. And whenever crime goes up, they say that's because somebody else didn't do what they were supposed to do, right? It's never their fault, right? The reality is that police can't solve these problems. No amount of drug arrests is going to stop the black market in drugs. And police are not able to end all the violence. And even when policing is somewhat effective, it comes at a huge cost. It comes at a financial cost, but it also comes at a cost in terms of ruined lives. Because the people who are being policed, even though they may have caused harm in the community, are still members of the community. And almost always are going to come back to the community. But they're going to come back in worse shape than when they left in many cases, right? So we haven't really solved the problem, and we haven't done anything to prevent the next 12, 13, 14-year-old from going down that same path. And this idea, well, we're going to use deterrence by destroying more lives, that'll deter the next group from doing that. But some 12, 13, 14-year-old kid who doesn't have enough to eat is not worrying about deterrence. They're worrying about staying alive. What do we do about it? What do we do about it, right? And different problems have to be addressed in different ways. There's not like this one size fits all solution. This is part of the problem. We've been told the solution to every problem is an armed police officer, but that's not the solution to everything. The problems of substance abuse, the problems of mental health, the problems of school discipline, these are different problems. There may be things that link them together, but there's not a one size fits all solution. You know, most of the young people involved in drug activity don't have a drug problem. They got a job problem. They don't need drug treatment. They need a job, or they need income supports, right? No one wants to talk about that. We've accepted this idea that we have to let free markets do whatever they want. Labor markets, housing markets, healthcare markets, and that everybody's just on their own in competition with everyone else from an unequal playing field even. And the reality is that the markets just don't care what happens to poor communities of color, except to the extent that they can steal more wealth from them. So we have to intervene in these markets. We have to demand that government put people to work. If we can put them work in the private sector, fine. But otherwise, we need to put people to work and at the very least, provide people with basic incomes to survive, whether it's this idea of a guaranteed basic income or something similar to that. Because we know one of the surest fire ways to stop involvement in black market activity and to reduce violence is to give people sufficient income to form a stable household. Because that's what people want. So let's make that possible for them. There's more than enough wealth in our society to do that. We just are using it in the wrong ways. We're more interested in creating billionaires than creating justice.
Something that came up for me there was for a moment you said, even when policing is effective. And, I want to highlight that I don't agree with that word, because for lack of better terms, I think that that effort is topical, merely putting a band-aid over the problem, but not peeling back anything to actually address what's there. And as we've discussed, and I don't know if Chief Zach is here, but I hope he took the time out of his evening to show up for this important conversation. But I think it's necessary to highlight that this is within this reactionary frame. It's like police do nothing within our community but allow for Black folk to feel unsafe. I guess I'll again tell a story, but within Asheville, almost half of our police force has quit in the past year. And so we're basically overpaying police officers to over police because a lot of them are getting overtime. And within our community, there is no trust within the system. And so like, we're currently working on our Walk the Walk campaign. And the other week we were in Hillcrest, and I'm not going to say any names, but someone, we work with within our campaign was there to witness a police chase. And when the perpetrator, I guess, got away from the police, the APD proceeded to turn their gun on them, right? And so there's already this, I don't know, it's just, there's no effective, APD is not effective in aiding those who are most impacted. APD is effective in upholding white supremacy and upholding, racial bias within our city, and upholding these systems that continue to disproportionately incarcerate and over police our neighborhoods. And yeah, I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, I meant to put like effective in quotes, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Right. So just to say that a particular definition of effective that the police consider valid, but that really doesn't meet our standards.
Yeah.
Doesn't calculate the costs, doesn't consider the alternatives.
Yeah. And if you don't mind, Rob, I'm going to kind of segue into another question that's further down our list that kind of continues into this conversation of like, so utilizing racial capitalism, what you were saying within like people profiting or not profiting off of the exploitation of our Black community, or not giving them the proper resources that are there, that are necessary. Utilizing this racial capitalism framework enables society to enact crime and punishment on Black and brown folk who are disproportionately affected by it. So within your work, how can we work towards, prison industrial complex abolition, and also address racial capitalism, right? Because those two intersect. Upon racial capitalism, the prison industrial complex is able to capitalize off of Black and brown bodies that are currently being thrown and repeatedly put back into the incarceral system. And so how do you see us addressing those two? And how do you think, I don't know, I guess one cannot exist without the other. And so how do we attack both of these things? Because I feel often people will advocate for prison industrial complex abolition, but not address that, the system has been profiting off of our bodies for 400 years and continues to do so, both implicit, for lack of better terms, implicitly and explicitly. And how do we combat that,
Yeah. So when I talk about this connection between like neoliberal austerity, this pushing wealth up the ladder and cutting services for the rest of us, right? That is a central feature of this system of racialized capitalism. And so this pushing wealth up the economic ladder benefits those who are already in a superior position, who are in a position to take advantage of these subsidies. right? Because we don't start at a level playing field. We have historically stolen the wealth and labor of Black and brown people and then blame them for being poor. And then, because they're poor, we define their behavior as criminal, and then we use the police to micromanage them, to keep them in a disadvantaged position, to constantly ding them with fines and fees that pulls wealth out of the community, to drive their young people into the criminal justice system. And this makes it difficult for them to overcome these historical inequities, right? It's not just keeping it unequal, it's actually making it worse. So we have to understand that the over-reliance on policing, or the reliance on policing, is always part of an economic project. It's not a freestanding thing. So I think a lot of abolitionists understand this, but I think it's a lot of liberals who imagine that we can just fix policing so that police can go back to helping us. They're the folks who have the inadequate analysis, who don't understand that policing has always been a system for reproducing inequality along lines of race and class. Whether it's the facilitation of slavery, the facilitation of colonialism through the Texas Rangers, the suppression of labor movements, and all the rest. So what's needed in this moment is exactly this understanding of the connection. A progressive tax increase on the rich to pay for mental health services is a police reform measure, because it reduces the centrality of policing in our lives. It makes our lives better so that police don't become a factor. So I'm so glad you asked that, because this is really essential to understanding this moment that we're in and the nature of the struggle we're in.
All right. So I want to take some time to go into some of the questions that people have been posting into the chat before we take a deeper dive into talking about the solutions. Like, we're still talking about the problem, explaining the problem, and I think we're really getting to a lot of the root, the root topics of what it is that we're dealing with here. So I'll start off with the next question from the chat. While it can be said that additional, hold on, make sure that I got this right. Let's start off at the top. Are there any specific cities or towns in NC that have successfully divested money from the police to community services for mental health, housing, etc.? I want to expand that question to, like, it doesn't have to be NC. Or, are you familiar with any of these cities, and are there other models from other cities to follow? You mentioned that communities that have implemented the solutions you advocate have improved the lives of Black and brown communities. Could you give some examples?
So, well, Durham has been doing some interesting stuff. So if you're not aware of what Durham is doing, you should totally look into that, because they've been organizing around this agenda for a long time. And so they've had some pretty concrete victories there that people should look at. Nationally, we're seeing a lot of changes happening, mostly in the cities where this kind of organizing has been going on for a long time, not just this summer, right? A lot of cities saw this kind of organizing for the first time this summer, including in some ways New York. And in New York, we didn't really get anything out of this. We got a lot of talk, but no action. But in Portland and Denver and Albuquerque and Austin and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Oakland and, people, St. Louis, people are winning concrete things. They're getting police out of schools. They're getting more counselors for young people and restorative justice programs. They're getting new mental health services. They're getting mental health crisis teams as opposed to sending the police. They're getting more money for community-based anti-violence efforts. Now, it doesn't always involve a dollar for dollar transfer from the police department to this program, right? Because the politicians don't want to frame it that way. And we don't need them to frame it that way. What we need them to do is to start investing in communities. And if they try to tell us there's no money to do that, then we can be like, well, actually, there's a lot of money right over there. It's called policing, and it doesn't work, and it's actually part of the problem. So don't tell me there's no money to do these things. So I get calls and emails every day from another city where they're trying to figure out how to do this. So this is a very vibrant, alive movement that it's not just about street protests. Just because you don't see street protests every day doesn't mean that organizing is not happening. Because organizing is not just about street protests. It's about talking to people. It's about connecting with our neighbors, our families, our friends, and talking to them about what these better choices could look like, and building up that consensus in the community that policing is not the only choice.
All right. I also am going to give one from the chat, but I'd like to speak on it first and kind of create a dialogue around this one, because I don't know, it kind of like sent shivers down my spine in a strange way. Is there hard evidence that the police departments have been systematically infiltrated by white supremacist groups? And for me, that answer for me is police departments are white supremacist groups. The police department was built upon slave patrol, was built upon, capturing slaves and enslaved people and returning them, to their masters. Like, that was the very basis of the policing system in America. And this is also very interesting because, and we can talk about this next, but a lot of folks keep bringing up like this idea, this point that like, oh, this one police officer, this one sheriff officer, this one, like military personnel was involved in the insurrection at the Capitol on the 6th, and everybody's still like focusing on individual repercussions rather than realizing that the reason those folks were at the Capitol is because they benefit and they support and they uphold the exact system that is what stormed the Capitol, that is that white supremacy, that is that hate. You know what I'm saying? And so I just wanted to hear your view on that, but I just wanted to bring that up.
So there's this deep historical analysis, which you shared some really important parts of it, right? That policing has always been a tool for reproducing racial inequality. And not just in relationship to slavery and not just in relationship to Black people, right? It's also been about the colonization of indigenous lands. It's been about the forced removal of Latinos from their historic homelands in the Southwest. It's been about the suppression of labor movements, right? So this idea that, oh, the KKK is infiltrating the police. No, the KKK and the police always work together because they're both part of a power structure that they share a common interest in. Now, contemporarily, we don't have the KKK, and we have this gloss of post-civil rights, colorblindness, and all this talk. And so we can't be explicitly, openly racist for the most part anymore. And we've disavowed some of these extremist groups. But we do have some concrete evidence. We see regular scandals. There were a group of sheriff's deputies in LA County who had tattoos. All of them had the same tattoo linked to a white supremacist organization. The FBI has said they have 2 investigations underway and have for a number of years about explicit efforts of white supremacist groups to infiltrate policing. And we need only look at what happened last week to see that there are police officers who are part of this right-wing nationalist extremist movement. We got a sergeant, head of the union in New York, who's got like a QAnon mug on his bookcase when he does television interviews, right? And while QAnon doesn't claims not to be racist, it is a white movement that sees conspiracies everywhere, that thinks Black Lives Matter is, devil worshipers and all the rest. So we know what these people believe. So I think the evidence is pretty clear, but the system reproduces racism, even if it's made up mostly of Black police officers and people who've had anti-bias training.
I think that's important to note too. You said a lot of people say, well, why don't just put more Black officers in Black communities, right? But the system that they work under, and I could really get into this, but the white supremacy doesn't only exist in white people, right? And as Black folk, a lot of us are constantly trying to dismantle the supremacy that exists in us. So to say that we should just, bring in more Black officers or officers of color is one, just reinforcing the system and creating more anti-Blackness, but also othering or dehumanizing Black people in general. And the fact of like saying that we are beside this like atrocity of like what white supremacy is and how it shows up in every single system that exists. And I don't know, just I want to
instead of hiring more Black police officers, how about we hire more Black school counselors and more Black community workers and more Black youth mentors and more Black job trainers and more Black public health nurses, right? Because these are the jobs that will actually help the community. And it turns out, right, that if you talk to young people who go into policing from communities of color, which job they would rather have, almost all of them would rather have these other jobs, but there were no such jobs for them to take. And even when there occasionally is one, it's for half or a quarter of the pay of a police officer.
Yeah, I just would like to add, the hiring of more officers of color is not a solution to me as well, or even the community policing thing, right? Like I was raised in an era where we had a couple community police officers that were of the same race as me and, knew our parents and aunts and everything. But that did not stop police brutality. What one takeaway that I will say that it presented is the officer that I have in mind, which I will not name, he wouldn't kill you, but he's gonna beat you. Like if you run, like it's the same underwritten rules. It's the culture of policing. If you run, you were gonna get beat. Even if you ran from other officers, if he's on duty and those officers have contacted him or he's heard it over the radio, he's most likely gonna come over the radio and tell them not to handcuff you until he gets there, so that you and him can have some one-on-one time. Like he had certain rules he went by. Like he wasn't gonna kill you, and after the handcuffs are on you, it's over. But at the end of the day, police brutality is police brutality. And you're asking, well, how is that possible? Isn't that illegal? And it's like, no, it's a gray area. If you're resisting arrest, that gives them the ability to use force. And this was a very big officer. And, in a weird sense, he's actually respected in the community. But when you take a step back and really look at it, police brutality is police brutality at the end of the day.
Well, he's blue first and Black second.
That is true.
That's what we find. That's what the research shows. And that's what the experience of people shows.
Yes. And I want to ask another question from the chat, and then I want to kind of phase over into some abolitionist questions, because that word frightens people. You know, people are afraid to talk about it. Oh, we can't live without police. Okay, so yeah, next question on our list. See, I think I'm gonna go to, are there any areas that research shows that policing increases safety?
So the problem is we have this approach in evaluation research that says, well, if we have a police intervention and we have a reduction in crime, then we say that policing works. And occasionally we get studies that show this, like hotspot policing in a particular area where there's like a pattern of violence and we flood it with police, there could be a reduction in violence for some period of time, and therefore policing works. The problem is that this research never measures what the cost of that intervention is. It just assumes that policing is cost-free and that the effects are only positive. It never thinks about, well, what was the impact of that policing on the community, on the people policed? So for instance, one of the things we know is that heavy police presence in communities of color has a direct effect on the physical and mental well-being of members of the community, that it reduces life expectancy. That stress of constant police presence, surveillance, and harassment actually causes people to die at a younger age. That never gets put into that equation. And we never measure, well, did it work better than some other approach? Like, could we have had the same effectiveness by doing something different? So for instance, we had an experiment here in Brooklyn not long ago, where in Brownsville, New York, which is an African-American community with a high level of poverty and an uptick in violence, they did an experiment for 5 days. They pulled the police out of a particular corridor in the community, and instead, community-based organizations set up a permanent presence along that corridor. People occupied those blocks. And for those 5 days, there was no violence. There was no police response requested. And things went very well. It cost less, and no one ended up incarcerated. So we always have to measure this question of effectiveness in a broader way. And when we do that, it's very hard to find clear evidence that there's some specific thing that the police do that works better than other things that we might try.
And while my partner is taking a very short break, I will ease into the next question. Wait on them to get back before we start talking about abolition. And in the current police punitive mindset, consent of those interacting with the police does not seem to be considered. What role does consent play in a new model of supporting folks in mental health crises and trauma responsive care, and then supporting residents in other crises?
I'm not sure I totally follow the question about consent. Can you ask the first part again?
Yes. In the current police punitive mindset, consent of those interacting with the police does not seem to be considered. For instance, you know.
Oh, okay. Let me try it here. Okay. So of course, when a young person is having a mental health crisis and the mom calls police, can she tell the police? She calls 911 asking for help, and she gets the police. Can she tell the police to go away? No, usually not. Once they've been called, they're going to be like, no, you got to let us in. Right. And then things spiral out of control sometimes. Right. If, however, there's a community-based mental health system with a drop-in center, maybe staffed by community members who've had their own challenges with mental health issues. It's all voluntary, right? And it's preventative. The idea is to catch a problem early so that it doesn't spiral out of control, so that we don't need an emergency response. So that's right. Police response is inherently coercive. And the whole point of this is to put systems in place that are not coercive.
Let's see.
I hope that answered it.
Yeah, it answered it for me. Very concise. And I'll just take this one, and then we'll phase back over to you, Grits. If a city such as Asheville,
I'm sorry. I want to follow up on that too, because I'm and I don't know why I'm confusing the plate. Someone fact checked me, but in Oregon, the decriminalization of all drugs over there. That was Oregon, correct?
That's right. That's in Oregon. It's decriminalize low-level possession of all drugs. That's right.
Yeah. So I think to continue on this discussion of what consent looks like, it looked like over there it was even though it was decriminalized, there was this response of almost forcing folk to go into rehabilitation. And I think that as we begin, which within itself is still incarceral in ways, it's still forcing someone into something and not giving them the consent to choose for themselves. I don't think drugs should be criminalized anywhere, but I don't think forcing someone into rehabilitation because it's this or something worse or more punitive, is also within itself kind of incarceral in ways. And so I think I often think regarding abolition and creating this community safety that we can shoot for the stars, but within that we also have to be malleable because as we're creating these alternatives within our community and creating resources, we have to understand that often our white supremacy may bleed into it too. So for example, in Oregon, with the kind of the forcing of attending rehabilitation, it's that structure still upholds white supremacy and pushing someone into something. And so as we're creating this, I think a consent-based model within our alternatives would be providing that option and decriminalizing things like drug abuse, and honestly decriminalizing mental health, because a lot of folk are unjustly put into places that after mental health crises that don't aid or benefit them in any way, and so I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm losing myself there, but
you raise an important cautionary point, right? We don't want to create a social welfare system that is just as carceral as policing.
Absolutely.
And there's a history of that. Child welfare systems, dealing with social workers in the welfare system, right? These were often abusive bureaucracies that also reproduced white supremacy. So my understanding about the Oregon thing is that forced treatment is just this tiny little sliver of last resort. It is not the first thing. This is they put that in there. It's if everything else fails, we're still not going to send you to jail, but we might send you to forced treatment.
Right.
But we know forced treatment doesn't work very well. That's the problem with things like drug courts and court mandated treatment. It doesn't work. So yes, we want to avoid coercive welfare state kind of interventions as well. Absolutely.
That's all I wanted to bring up there.
Okay, I've got an eye on time, but also I want to bring up a few more questions before we again phase into some more direct abolitionist talk. First question is, or the next question, has there been the development of a police divestment toolkit that you would recommend for elected officials or for advocates. And I'm familiar with a few myself. The movement for Black Lives definitely has some divest and invest in community toolkits. But what would you recommend?
Yeah, well, we're working on it. So I actually was working with them today on this. So there's going to be a website, defundthepolice.com, and also the community hub for safety and justice is developing a website that's actually going to have a live chat function. So we're trying to put these resources together in a way that's really accessible. People can send me a note and I can, help refer them to these as they come online. And there's a community of people who are helping individual cities as best we can with the capacity that we have, to do this stuff. But yeah, we're working on it.
And so do you want to go ahead and segue into abolitionist questions? The one.
These have all been abolitionist questions.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So,
but
oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, just the ones that sometimes make the hair on our neck stand up, like violent crime and, reimagining this. So do we want to segue into that, or a few more questions, general questions?
No, we can go ahead and segue. I mean, it's up to you. But yeah, I will add that like all of these are like, I think that's the misunderstanding, right? Like people say, well, are you for reform or abolition? And I'm like, well, technically I'm an abolitionist, but I classify myself as a long-term abolitionist because my idea of abolition is not today we have police and tomorrow we have no police with the resources and tools and infrastructure that's needed to address the situations that cause people to commit crime in the first place, right? So it's like phasing them out of a position that they're completely unequipped to be in is what abolition to me, is about. Getting these alternatives in so that we can get them to whether, it's a lot less interaction in between police and community. The model that Grits was talking about up in Minneapolis, where you have this community that is banded together and community members call on each other to solve issues, is beautiful. If something like that could be funded, it could be so much more beautiful. One of the primary points that the city here locally, uses when pertaining to reimagining policing is that they don't have the infrastructure for such things. And, technically, I guess they are kind of right because it is new and they don't have the foundation of what's necessary set up, and to phase from where they're at now into something that they know nothing about can be scary. And so, again, I would like you to give your understanding of what abolition is and what it actually means and what it looks like, so that people can gain some understanding around the word. It's definitely different from abolishing slavery, because I would have definitely said, yes, slavery should end right now. We don't need any alternatives to slavery. But, policing has been put in position to be, the solution for so many of our social concerns that should be addressed in different forms and fashions, whether it's employment programs, whether it's mental health services, whether it's substance abuse treatment centers, whether it's grants for business startups, home ownership, and hiring people within all of these institutions that represent our racial demographic. That is what the alternatives to policing look like to me. But yeah, I'll turn it over to you now, Alex, to give your answer towards abolition, what it looks like and what it really means.
I heard that somewhere behind City Hall in Asheville, there's a switch. And if we could just find it, we could turn all police off tomorrow. right? This is not an option. There is no city council that's going to turn the police off tomorrow.
No.
So this idea that what we're saying is we want there to be no police tomorrow, that is what's used to discredit us or to ignore us or whatever. We're the ones who understand there is no turning off police tomorrow. There's a massive apparatus of policing. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out how to dial it back one step at a time and replace it with something better. And this requires experimentation and evaluation, and there's going to be mistakes, and we're going to have to make, adjustments as we go. Abolition is, in part, it's an analysis, right? That policing is the wrong tool, that policing is not a tool of liberation. It's been a tool of oppression. And so that analysis helps us to avoid the mistake of thinking that the goal of police reform is to restore the community's trust in the police so that the police can get on with their job of oppression. But it's also a process. Abolition is a process, right? As Rob laid out, it's a process of identifying these alternative strategies, getting them in place while we dial back policing. And finally, for me, abolition is about a vision. It's about a desire to live in a world where safety isn't produced by filling our communities with people with guns or putting human beings into cages. And I think everyone would like to live in a world like that. But I don't claim to know exactly what that world would look like or exactly how to get there. I'm not trying to reverse engineer some imagined utopia. I'm trying to deal with the fact that policing is harming us. We know how to do things better, and let's start doing that. Let's start demanding what we really want to make communities safer and healthier places instead of accepting this false choice of policing or nothing. And let me just say just a quick thing about slavery abolition. Slavery abolition was an urgent, immediate need, but Reconstruction was aborted before we were able to radically improve the conditions for Black people. And we're still suffering the consequences of that. So even the abolition of slavery needed more investments, more resources, more lifting people up, more leveling the playing field. And we never got that. We never got 40 acres and a mule. We never got the Freedmen's Bureau fully doing what it was supposed to be doing, right? And as a result, white supremacy was able to come back in and push people back down into second-class citizenship to establish Jim Crow that dominated the lives of Black people for another 100 years.
A question that comes up for me is one that came up, nationally, and is a large fear of folks within the nation with such a large call for abolition or divestment and investment. And I'd like you to touch on that too, if you have a chance. Like, why do you think, and I understand that George Floyd was murdered and people saw for almost 9 minutes a video of a man's life being taken, right? But we have seen so many videos and we have lost way more folk than media has covered. And so why do you think it was 2020 that on a national scale, people were talking about abolition and divestment and investment and defundment within our police department?
I mean, I don't have a simple answer to that. Who can predict these things? I think obviously it had been building. The organizing didn't stop after Mike Brown, after Eric Garner, right? The organizing kept happening. People weren't seeing it on the nightly news, but I was seeing it. I had the luxury of being in, you know, a couple dozen cities a year the last several years before COVID, working with these movements like I'm here with you tonight virtually. So I knew this was all percolating. And the George Floyd incident was not a cause, it was a trigger, right? It was that final straw, if you will. I mean, I would never have predicted it. I think the pressures of COVID played a role. I think the fact that the Democratic Party as a party had turned its back on doing anything about this problem, right? By choosing Biden, this was a signal that police are going to get more money. They were going to turn more problems over to police, right? Biden's response to last week is we're going to create more terrorism laws and create more police power to deal with that. So I think that was part of the factor. You know, if George Floyd had been killed and let's say the Bernie Sanders campaign was going to be the nominee, that it might have looked differently. But that's just speculation. I don't know.
And then my second part of that question was just many people bring up the fear of violent crime. If police disappear, how can we stop violent crime? And people have listed off like the most terrible, heinous things to me. You know, it's like, how do we stop this?
Yeah, terrible things like the mass poisoning of people with lead in their water supply, or the mass poisoning of communities with toxic fallout from corporate polluters, the mass violence of throwing millions of people out of their homes out onto the streets after the 2008 financial crisis. So let's not forget all that violence.
Come on.
That is just ignored, that is done with impunity, that is the friends of people in high places, right? So that's violence too. That is ending lives, shortening lives, degrading lives, primarily in poor Black and brown communities. We don't do anything about that. What about, though, interpersonal violence? We have to take that very seriously, right? I mean, this is a movement for public safety, led primarily by women of color who have experienced a lot of violence in their lives and for whom policing was no solution. So first of all, police are not doing a very good job. I mean, if that's their job, they're not doing a very good job, because we got a lot of violence in our society, especially for women. We know that the vast majority of violence against women is never even reported to the police. People have just given up on the possibility that police are the solution to their being sexually assaulted by intimate partners. People know that doesn't work. Even in the middle of an acute crisis, people are not calling the police. So let's be realistic about that, right? If policing was so great, if that was the solution to our problems, then why do we have all these problems? Now, having said all that, I'm not trying to avoid what do we do with X. So first of all, what have we done to try to prevent X from happening in the first place? Right? Policing is reactive. Police come after someone has been harmed and throw a sheet over the body, right? Or take someone to the hospital and take a report, most of which doesn't get solved. And even when it does, doesn't necessarily prevent future harm from happening. Now, not all interpersonal violence is the same. The dynamics that drive domestic partner violence, the dynamics that maybe drive the abuse of children, the dynamics of like tit for tat violence among young people out in the neighborhood, the violence of a school shooter, the violence of a white supremacist, these are not all the same thing. And the solutions to them is not all the same. What are we doing about family supports? What are we doing to create early warning systems? Let's look at like school shooters for a second. oh, well, we got to have police in the schools to stop the school shooters. Well, first of all, that doesn't work. There were armed police at Columbine. There were armed police at Parkland. They didn't stop the violence. But in both those cases, and in almost all these school shooter cases, someone knew. Someone had a pretty good idea that this person was going to do something terrible. And in some cases, they told the police and nothing was done about it. Right? In Parkland, people said, this guy is going to do something. And what did the police do? They went and knocked on his door and said, are you going to do something? You know? And he said, no. And they're like, well, that's all we can do. And of course, most young people don't want to say anything when they suspect their friend is in crisis, because who wants to be the kid in high school that turns their friend into the police? Nobody. So they don't say anything, because we've turned that whole system into a police problem. Where are the non-police early warning systems that could identify someone who may be going towards a crisis and try to interrupt that process and pull them out of that dynamic, whether it's driven by bullying, a mental health crisis, whatever, white supremacist worldviews, whatever it is. I'll give you just an example of how not to do this. In Denver, there was a student at a university who was acting out, and students and faculty were like, this person is scaring us. We are afraid that this person is going to do something. So they started off on the right track. They identified the problem. They had a meeting. They brought together the teachers and the clinical staff at the college, and they all agreed, oh, there's a problem here. So what did they do? They expelled the student. And so what did the student do? Instead of shooting up a school classroom, he went and shot up a movie theater in the community. Right? They didn't follow through. They identified the problem and then they just pushed it off into the community instead of actually dealing with it. We got to actually deal with these problems, which means we have to have infrastructures and resources in place. And just having the police is not going to save us. We need people who can intervene when a family's in crisis. We need people who can intervene when there's a gang war underway. And there are people who know how to do this. Violence interrupters, credible messengers. We need to empower them too, give them resources and let them go out and work with people to break that cycle of violence. So we have a lot of ideas about how to reduce violence. We have a lot of research that shows the effectiveness of these interventions. And we have to quit pretending that the thing that we have now is so fantastic, because it's not.
And a topic that I wanted to bring up is, I feel as if we were already moving towards a lot of the solutions that were working in our community. And I'm gonna bring up a organization that our government has villainized, and that's the Black Panther Party. And if you think about why they were created and what they actually did, bring community together and protect their community. And, our government came in and systematically destroyed that. So it's like what we're asking for now is basically what they were implementing back then. Only it's like you destroyed us in our processes. So now, and you've divested from our communities. You've got us in such a state of oppression, and we have the policies, we have the metrics that come in the form of disparities to show improve all these things over the past 150 years, whether you want to look at urban renewal or anything else. It's like now we're asking for the resources to be able to build these systems within our communities, because police have never been the solution for our issues of communities of color. And like we realized this early on, and we started trying to solve some of it. And I don't know. It's real crazy to me how I look back, and a lot of the alternatives which are being implemented in other cities, a lot of the programs that are being implemented in other cities actually started up in the 60s and 70s. You know what I mean? And we're systematically shut down. It's like, no, you're gonna have to depend on us in this system, you know. And then you had it to where it branched off into gangs, and it's like police villainize gangs so much. And it's like, when you really do the history and you go back, it's like, you created the gangs. Like, the gangs were first created to protect their neighborhoods from law enforcement, and now it's then turned in, you know, to this whole monster. It's like, now you're reaping what you're sowing, but you don't want to show that part. You know, you want to show the law enforcement officers like, oh, we protect the community. What are you gonna do without us? The gangs will feed on you. And it's like, but yeah, I digress from my diatribe that I'm going on. So back to abolition and back to the questions at hand. A city like Asheville, where we're at in, is just the conversation of reimagining policing. You know, if you could, what would you advise that we do, that are our next best steps to moving into actually realizing reimagining policing and divesting from law enforcement and investing in community, and, you know, then pushing us further down the road towards what could be very similar to abolition?
Great. Well, the first thing is to change the name to Reimagining Public Safety, not Reimagining Policing. I mean, that's
I pronounced that wrong. It is actually technically Reimagining Public Safety.
okay. Well, that's good, because that's what we're doing here, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've been told that all we need to do is fix policing, and that's not what we need to do, right? We need to get policing out of our lives in as many ways as we can reasonably figure out how to do. So my advice, based on what I've been seeing happening around the country, is that the thing to start is to do a community needs assessment. What are the public safety challenges that communities are facing? Because they're not all the same, right? Different neighborhoods have different challenges. And we need to have tailored strategies to address those specific challenges. Now, that process has to keep in mind that while people have a lot of knowledge and wisdom about what's going on around them, it's not perfect. People watch the news media and other things that can distort their understanding of what's going on. Everyone thinks crime is out of control everywhere, and actually that's not true, right? Crime's been falling for a generation. So we have to have a dialogue with people about what we have actual information about, what's a perception, you know, but we got to tap into that community wisdom. But also we need to provide people with some resources, some intellectual knowledge, not intellectual, but knowledge resources, right? Because just because you're experiencing violence in your community and you're experiencing bad policing doesn't mean that you've read the research on credible messenger programs in Chicago or public health initiatives in Portugal, right? So we need those toolkits, those resources, these menus of ideas, not as a preformed plan to be plopped down on the neighborhood, but as a menu that people can pick and choose from and then customize for the specific needs of their community. And that take into account the resources that already exist, that maybe are inadequate or need to be rejiggered or just built on. I think that's the way to do it. And that's what was the concept in Minneapolis that was talked about this summer. And it's gotten off track a little bit because of these technical things about changing the charter and retrenchment by the more conservative members of the city council. But I'm hopeful that they're going to get back on track with that. And that's what other cities are moving towards as well. So my job is not to tell you here are the 3 things you should do. My job is to help you think about how to move forward and to provide resources to help stimulate the local planning.
And, you know, I think you've done just that. You know, one of the first things you brought up was a large piece of community engagement, where you said, you know, connecting with the community and getting out there and talking with people. And that's largely what we're currently doing with our Walk the Walk program, which I'm pretty sure you're not very familiar with. But we're going and we're having these tough conversations with community members, and we're doing engagement completely differently. You know, for one, we're paying community members to do outreach with us, and we're also paying them gift cards to participate in taking the survey. You know, so we're paying them for their time and letting them know that their responses is valued. And we plan on getting behind their voices instead of speaking as representatives for the community. It's like, no, let's bring these
Perfect.
into the room. You know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
listen to them. Like, don't hear it from me.
And I want to say something to that as well. And yeah, the Walk the Walk campaign has been very transformative. And, you know, the connection that we've been making with community is so empowering. And finally, they're like, oh, you know, like, wait, I can, you know, like, y'all want to hear from me about how I feel about police in my neighborhood? You know what I'm saying? Like, but what also comes up for me is like, Asheville is a wealthy city as well. And there's a lot of upper middle class and upper class white folk here. So like us Black folk and POC shouldn't just be doing this work in disenfranchised communities. Like it's up to white folk to talk, rich white folk to talk to those other rich white folk as well, you know, because we can't just have this conversation with those most disenfranchised. You know what I'm saying? Like we have to be having these conversations on all levels. It can't just be Black and brown people, because then again, it's othering. It's like, oh, it's their problem. No, it's all of our problems. So how are you like holding yourself accountable and doing work within your own neighborhood? You know, like if you live in Montford, find a pamphlet, you know, find out what divestment and investment means, and like go talk to your neighbors. I know y'all be talking to each other up there. Like I see it driving through there. Like these conversations can be had, you know, and they don't just have to be had in our communities.
Absolutely. And that we need to build solidarities with religious communities, progressive organizations, peace groups, you know, who can do that work in their own communities and who can also ideally, right, talk about the ways in which white people are mobilizing policing against other people to reassure themselves about something that often is not real. And even when it is real, they don't consider what the consequences are of mobilizing that policing apparatus against the other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So everybody needs to hear these stories.
Absolutely. All right, 15 minutes left. Do you have a question from the questions you want to pull out, Rob, or should I pick one? There's been a lot of good questions tonight. I don't think we can get to all of them.
Yeah, there's a whole lot in there. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Pick out whatever you feel.
All right, that's why me and Rob have been looking down at our phones this whole time. We're just trying to find out which one to give next.
We've covered a lot of territory.
Yeah, we have.
Yeah.
I like this one. And in regards to the need for mental health services instead of police, and we kind of touched on this a little earlier, so if you think you already said enough, we can just pass it. But how can we pull from one failed system to remedy another? How do we address the similar challenges in our current mental health system?
Right. So part of the needs assessment that needs to be done is to find out what already exists and what the limitations are on it. So oftentimes mental health systems have been so defunded that they engage in a kind of triage and are often, you know, rooted in a medical model that is often undermines ideas about consent. So that's why I brought up like the idea of peer-to-peer, low threshold, entry level access to the system. And a lot of cities don't have this. And yet there's really strong research about its effectiveness. So LA County has started doing this, and people can try to look that up. And this is, an example of how we don't want to just reproduce that system. We want to make a new system that's better. And that ideally, right, has some accountability to the local community.
Another good one is, do you think that the movement needs different slogans for greater political acceptance or success rather than defund?
Well, what do you think?
What do I?
You're out there talking to people every day, right? With the walk the walk. Are you going around carrying a sign saying defund the police?
No, but I think I am at this point in my life where I am especially done sugarcoating things to kind of meet liberals and centrists in the middle. When I say defund, I mean defund. If you can't look to the police system and see that it is failing in so many ways and say, hey, maybe this $30 million for 100,000 people in a city, maybe we could use some of that money to go to some other resources, especially since we're, supposedly 10th in the nation, like something's not working here. So something has to give. Like, if you can, like, I think that's just as palatable as it gets. I get like some people are like, oh, abolition, that means no more. Like I can see how that can be difficult to digest at times. But I think especially with like defund and divestment and investment, it's like, I don't know, if you can look me in the face and tell me that the police system is working perfectly, I won't believe you, but it's just like, where have you been? Like, like what rose, I want some of those rose-colored glasses that you're like sitting behind that says like, these systems as they are working perfectly, because that means they are working perfectly for you. You know what I'm saying? And we are familiar with like a demographic of who that's working perfectly for. And so,
but when you're going around talking to people, you're not just repeating a slogan, defund the police, right? You're actually talking to people.
Do you feel comfortable? Yeah. Do you feel comfortable in your community with police? I have not gotten one yes.
Yeah. So here's the thing is that too often people think that what we have to do is we have to come up with a slogan that captures what people already believe and mobilizes it. This is this getting elected mindset. That if the politician just gives a good enough speech, that people will see that they agree with it and they will rally to the person. But that's not what we're doing. We are changing people's minds. We're changing people's minds by having conversations with them that are two-way conversations. That's what organizing is. It's about moving people. It's not about slogans, right? Slogans are when everybody already agrees with you, right? What we're trying to move the conversation. So I'm not invested in slogans. I'm invested in community organizing, in talking to people. And I don't use slogans when I talk to people. I talk to people from a position of mutual respect. I don't go around saying defund the police all the time, right? I mean, I'll talk about it and what I think it means, but in a conversation like this, I would be perfectly happy if we never use that particular 3-word phrase. I don't have any investment in that 3-word phrase. I have an investment in explaining these things and talking to people about them and hearing what they have to say. So no, I don't think we need new slogans. I think we need more organizing.
Do you deeper conversation for sure.
You know, I'm gonna be honest. I see the issue is heavily a money issue. Like, you know, was it David Rothschild's, as one of his famous quotes was, you know, let me control the money and I care not who make the laws. Like, you know, the rich control the laws. I mean, the police protect the rich, they protect the powerful, and that's who pulls the levers behind the politicians and the politics, right? So it's like, as people, I feel like there's this illusion to where they try to make us feel like we have the power to change a lot of things, but we've seen where we've come together as a people and like nothing still changes. Like all the protests, like the millions of people that protested and still around the nation, so much didn't change. A lot did change. We've gotten a lot done, but it's like, at the end of the day, our elected officials don't even have to listen to us, or they can listen to a particular group that's getting them back in power, or the quote unquote majority. And a lot of the times the majority does not want change because change has been benefiting them. So it's like, how do you get past that when it's like, okay, you know, keep the police in your neighborhood, you know, build more park. Here's a very wealthy community. I'm sure they don't have any problem with law enforcement. They've got wonderful relationships. Nobody's getting arrested. And there's probably more drugs over there than there is in any public housing in Asheville. You know, they got all the money to pay for it. You know,
You got the really good ones.
when I was in the game, I'm telling you, these wealthy people are purchasing. They are purchasing.
Well, and they don't have to buy them on the black market. They just go to their doctor and they get a prescription.
That too. Some of them, yeah. But anyway, the point I'm getting at is like I'm gonna go back to what you said earlier on, and which I say all the time. I'm all the time saying this. Each community needs something specifically different, specifically for their community. You know, when we're out in the community doing our walk the walk, Hillcrest has different issues than what Shiloh would have. You know what I mean? Shiloh has different issues than what East End or Burton Street or Deaverview or PVA, like all of these places have different issues. And you know, maybe for these people that love what they have going on as far as law enforcement, it's like, okay, well, y'all keep that over there, but let us get resources to address the problems that have came out of the oppression that has been the outcome of the policies, the discrimination, and just the massive amount of disenfranchisement that has happened to our demographics over the past few centuries.
And this raises the issue of reparations, I think, as well.
Exactly.
Because there's a reason why these neighborhoods look different.
Exactly.
Right? It's not an accident. It's not because of cultural inferiority or something, right? It's about centuries of direct economic exploitation. And so there's some obligation to address that.
That is right. But it's hard to get them to, they've admitted it. You know, we have a reparations resolution here. So they've admitted to a lot of the harms: blockbusting, predatory lending, redlining, racial discrimination in employment, racial discrimination in housing, urban renewal, black slave codes, segregation, slavery, period. Like, they've admitted to these, and they've actually signed into words a commitment to address those issues. But it's hard to try to get some funding behind it, or allow the community to control it. Not a nonprofit organization, mine included, not a entity of any sort, whether corporate or any type of 501c3, period. Like, create a structure, bring our community in and let us figure this out. Not perceived leaders. Let each community pick who they want to represent them. Go to the people and ask them, speak with them directly. Don't go to the middleman. Don't go to, you know, who you would call a quote unquote leader, including myself. Go directly to the people. But they don't get that. It's like they're so caught up in and moving in their bureaucracy and their white supremacist mindset that they can't see the solution is just
too scary. They don't trust people. What about some kind of like a participatory budgeting structure that's very democratic? I mean, there's different ways of doing that, but that's something you might look into.
Yeah, I've shifted the conversation. We're supposed to stay on abolition and policing.
No, but we
digress.
understand these things are related, right? These economic
Of course.
questions are related. I think we've established that. So this is not a separate conversation.
They're all so interconnected, right? Like you're not gonna fix the opportunity/achievement gap without working on housing, without working on economics, without working on job employment, without working on startup business, without working on generational wealth that put us in this situation in the first place. I mean, without working on infrastructure, without working on diversity and having individuals that represent our demographics within each of these systems, you know, health, social determinants of health. A lot of that has to do with we don't have a lot of representation of our own people in that industry, you know, and so much more. But I don't know. I digress. That's too much for people to bite off, right? Like people just want to pick out.
You have to have agendas and campaigns, and you have to be strategic, and that's hard to try to figure out where do we focus now. But yeah, if you're going to bring people with you, you can't try to do everything at once. You can have an analysis about how things are connected, but you got to run campaigns that are winnable, that people can see the utility of and the possibility of winning. And then you build on that and you move on to the next thing and you deepen the analysis and you build your skills and you broaden your movement.
We have 1 more minute left. So I don't know. It's a wonderful place to cap. Also, there's been a lot of questions about the juicy, great capital debacle that happened. And are we interested in taking a few more minutes, or should we?
I need to end, I'm afraid. So yeah, I got to get my kids to sleep.
For sure. All right. Well, thank you so much.
It has been my pleasure, and I love to hear about what's happening in these places that I visit. I'm only sorry that I couldn't come in person and be with people, you know, in person and hear more about, you know, the organizing you're doing. But I hope you'll stay in touch, and I'll be watching from afar from over here in Brooklyn.
Good. All right. Well, thank you so much, Alex.
Most welcome.
Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time and conversation. And I hope that our community here listening in got a lot out of this tonight. I hope we were able to address, you know, a lot of the questions that they had.
For sure. And I am always willing to continue this conversation, and also note that I am constantly learning about this and abolition with folk if they're interested. And I can send out my RJC email if anyone wants to continue.
Get a study group going.
For sure.
Thank you again to our co-sponsors, the Elders Vigil and the Ethical Humanist Society of Asheville. And I think we'll go ahead and turn it in for the night. Love to honor people's time, and we're already a minute over. Thank you, Alex. Say good night to your family for us. Good night, everybody. Thank you for tuning in.
Good night, y'all.